Containment governance. When systems stabilize instead of transform. Modern governance does not fail only when institutions collapse. Sometimes the system remains formally intact. Parliament still sits, budgets are still passed, courts still operate, public agencies still function. Elections still occur, policy language still sounds familiar. But beneath the surface, the operating pattern changes. Government stops expanding. Reform slows. Public spending tightens. Risk management becomes central. Enforcement becomes more visible. Operational burden moves downward. Institutions try to preserve order without redesigning the structures that produce the pressure. This is the problem addressed by containment governance. Containment governance is a PI framework for analyzing democratic systems operating under fiscal constraint and high symbolic intensity. It asks a disciplined question: is the system transforming the underlying problem, or merely containing its visible effects? Containment governance does not begin with collapse. It begins with pressure: fiscal pressure, administrative pressure, public pressure, media pressure, legitimacy pressure, implementation pressure. In such conditions, governments often face a narrowing field of action. Large reforms become expensive. Structural redesign becomes politically risky. Public expectations remain high. Institutional capacity becomes stretched. Media systems amplify conflict. Opposition rhetoric intensifies. Citizens experience friction at the front line. The result is a high-signal governance environment. Political speech circulates rapidly. Fragments are amplified. Headlines compress complexity. Symbolic conflict becomes more visible than institutional design. The public encounters the symbol before it encounters the structure. This creates a diagnostic danger. Observers may mistake rhetorical escalation for structural transformation. They may see enforcement expansion and conclude authoritarian drift. They may see budget restraint and conclude democratic decline. They may see political conflict and conclude institutional breakdown. Sometimes those conclusions may be correct, but containment governance insists on evidential discipline. Not every rhetoric and invocation signals structural substitution. Not every fiscal contraction signals institutional collapse. Not every enforcement measure signals authoritarian consolidation. This is why the framework begins with SLIP, the structural limit of interpretation principle. SLIP is a methodological guardrail. It says that structural classification is permissible only when three conditions are met: responsibility anchoring evidential density, durability. Responsibility anchoring asks, can we identify who made the decision? Evidential density asks, do we have primary documentation, budgets, legislation, implementation records, or form instruments? Durability asks, has the pattern persisted beyond a single episode, announcement, or media cycle? If these conditions are not met, interpretation must contract. The claim must remain provisional. This is not analytical weakness, it is diagnostic discipline. In high-signal environments, the temptation is to classify too quickly. But governance structures move more slowly than rhetoric. Signal moves fast. Structure consolidates slowly. Containment governance therefore separates signal from structure. Signal includes speeches, slogans, headlines, metaphors, media fragments, and public contestation. Structure includes authority, procedure, budget allocation, implementation capacity, enforcement mandates, and institutional design. Both matter, but they are not the same. Signal invites inquiry. Structure justifies classification. Without this distinction, analysis becomes part of the symbolic escalation it is trying to understand. The second tool is the SSBM, the Symbolic Substantive Balance Model. The SSBM maps governance along two axes. The first axis is symbolic intensity. How much rhetoric escalation, adversarial framing, media amplification, and public contestation is present. The second axis is design capacity. How strong is the institution's ability to formulate, fund, implement, and sustain policy architecture? These two dimensions are independent. A system may have high symbolic intensity and high design capacity. That may simply be competitive democratic governance. A system may have high symbolic intensity and low design capacity. That may indicate symbolic substitution or containment pressure. A system may have low symbolic intensity and high design capacity. That may indicate technocratic consolidation. A system may have low symbolic intensity and low design capacity. That may indicate administrative drift. The purpose of the model is not to label regimes. It is to prevent misclassification. It asks, is rhetoric rising faster than institutional change? Is design capacity weakening beneath quiet language? Is enforcement becoming more visible because structural reform is deferred? Is the system preserving institutional form while compressing operational flexibility? These questions lead to the core of containment governance. Containment governance is not a policy platform. It is not an ideology. It is not a regime type. It is a stabilization pattern under constraint. It appears when fiscal contraction and high symbolic pressure produce a repeated behavioral configuration. The framework identifies 5 main indicators. First, cost compression with structural preservation. The system reduces spending, narrows programs, delays expansion, or tightens eligibility. But it does not abolish the core institution. The form remains. The flexibility narrows. Second, visible order prioritization. Under constraint, governments may favor visible order maintenance measures. Public order, compliance, enforcement, risk control. These are often faster, cheaper, and more communicatively legible than structural reform. Third, delegated operational burden. Pressure moves downward from central government to agencies, from agencies to frontline staff, from frontline staff to local authorities, from local authorities to households. Formal authority may remain unchanged, but operational strain migrates. Fourth, risk management framing. The language of governance shifts toward prudence, discipline, stability, fiscal responsibility, and control. The system becomes less expansionary, it becomes more defensive. For a free-form deferral, large structural redesign is postponed. The system avoids transformation. It chooses stabilization. It holds the line. No single indicator is enough. Containment is not declared by rhetoric. It is inferred from durable convergence. This is the central diagnostic profile. Containment preserves form while compressing function. That is its essential logic. This is why containment governance must be distinguished from adjacent patterns. It is not the same as retrenchment. Retrenchment reduces institutional scope or withdraws public commitment. Containment preserves institutional architecture while compressing operations. It is not the same as authoritarian consolidation. Authoritarian consolidation concentrates authority, weakens oversight, and alters constitutional safeguards. Containment may increase enforcement salience, but it does not necessarily dismantle accountability structures. It is not the same as administrative drift. Drift is weakening without stabilizing strategy. Containment is purposeful stabilization under constraint. It is an adaptive equilibrium. But it is also ethically ambiguous. Containment can be necessary. A government under fiscal pressure may need to stabilize spending. A public agency under strain may need to prioritize risk. A system facing volatility may need to preserve order. But containment can also become dangerous, because containment may manage the surface while leaving the structure unchanged. It may reduce visibility without reducing harm. It may move people out of public space without resolving homelessness. It may reduce emergency housing numbers without securing durable tenancy. It may increase welfare compliance without improving employment capability. It may expand enforcement without increasing social repair. It may shift costs downstream while preserving fiscal credibility upstream. This is the danger. Containment can look like control while producing displacement. It can look like discipline while producing burden transfer. It can look like stability while postponing structural resolution. The question is not whether containment is good or bad in the abstract. The question is whether it remains transitional. Does containment buy time for structural redesign, or does containment become the operating model? This is where the PI distinction matters. Containment governance stabilizes surfaces. Structural governance alters load-bearing architecture. Containment governance asks analysts to follow the burden. Where did responsibility move? Where did cost reappear? Who now absorbs the strain? What remains visible? What has disappeared from public view? And what evidence would show whether containment has become resolution, displacement, or drift?
And what evidence would show whether containment has become resolution, displacement, or drift? This is why longitudinal analysis is essential. A single policy episode does not establish containment. A single headline does not establish structural shift. A single enforcement measure does not establish authoritarianism. The test is duration. Do the indicators persist across fiscal intervals? Do they appear across multiple domains? Do downstream costs rise? Do structural outcomes improve? Do visible reductions correspond to real resolution? Or do pressure and harm simply move elsewhere? Containment governance therefore insists on outcome metrics, not only volume reduction, not only visible order, not only fiscal savings, but durable resolution. This model is especially important for democratic analysis, because democracies under constraint are often misread in two opposite ways. One error is inflationary diagnosis. Everything becomes collapse. Every enforcement measure becomes authoritarian drift. Every budget cut becomes democratic erosion. Every rhetorical escalation becomes systemic breakdown. The other error is normalization bias. Everything is treated as ordinary. No structural pattern is recognized. Slow compression is ignored. Responsibility displacement becomes invisible. Containment governance avoids both errors. It does not amplify crisis language, but it does not retreat from diagnosis. It asks for evidence. It maps signal against structure. It tracks fiscal contraction. It identifies directional indicators. It demands longitudinal confirmation, and it keeps classification provisional where evidence remains incomplete. The model therefore gives PI a disciplined method for analyzing governance under pressure. It allows us to say, this is not collapse. This is not necessarily authoritarianism. This is not ordinary stability either. This may be containment. A system holding itself together under constraint, a system preserving institutional form while compressing operational capacity, a system managing risk while deferring structural transformation, a system stabilizing visible order while pushing burden downstream. This matters because containment may be the characteristic governance mode of fiscally constrained democracies in high-signal environments. Containment becomes attractive because it is immediate, it is legible, it is fiscally contained, it promises order, but the deeper question remains, does containment lead back to structural governance, or does it become a substitute for it? That is the decisive test. PR therefore treats containment governance as a diagnostic category, not a slogan. It is a way to distinguish adaptive equilibrium from structural transformation. It is a way to prevent symbolic intensity from overwhelming evidence. It is a way to ask whether governance is truly resolving pressure or merely managing its appearance. The core insight is this: containment is not failure by definition, but containment becomes failure when stabilization replaces transformation permanently. A mature governance system may need to contain, but it must also know when containment has reached its limit. It must restore capacity. It must re-anchor responsibility. It must rebuild design depth. It must move beyond visible order towards structural repair. It must distinguish holding from governing, because the purpose of governance is not merely to keep the system from breaking. The purpose of governance is to preserve the conditions under which justified action remains possible. Containment governance helps us see when a system is holding the line, and it helps us ask whether the line is being held so that reform can occur, or so that reform can be avoided. PI a discipline, not a trend, a framework, not an opinion. Frameworks turn complexity into admissible decision.